Welcome to the Unfiltered Autistic podcast, the podcast that aims to give an unfiltered account of autistic lived experiences. Created and hosted by me, Amanda McGuinness, an autistic autism and visual support specialist and parent to 4 neurodivergent children. You are welcome to today's episode, which will be a 2-part episode, this being episode 1. This episode of the Unfiltered Autistic podcast is going to focus on my eldest son's autism diagnosis, so my beautiful Conor. I think it's a really important episode in that hopefully, or unfortunately even, it might highlight the struggles that parents go to have their children identified needlessly, that parents should be listened to early on when they have concerns, and that I'd ask, I suppose, if there's any healthcare professionals listening, that they really take on board the impact not being listened to can have on parents. So I'll go back to the beginning. My gorgeous Conor today is almost 15 years old, but 15 years ago, almost, my beautiful Conor was born. And he was born in the middle of the night in March of that year. And I remember from the moment that he was born, our whole lives changed. I would say for the better. Maybe for a while there was a struggle, but it was for the better ultimately, because it really, for myself personally as an autistic parent, it really woke me up to, as I will often say, it was as if Conor lifted the veil that was in front of my eyes about what was really happening in the world. So Conor was born in the middle of the night in March. And when he was born, I suppose a few different things stood out to me. First of all, when he was being born, the room was full of healthcare professionals. Looking back now, I will often wonder why that was, because when Haley was born and his 2 little brothers, there was less people in the room, certainly, but I distinctly remember the labour room where I was giving birth, seemed to be full of people. In hindsight, I'm going to take an educated guess and say that there was concerns for myself or for Conor at the time, but I suppose for whatever reason they didn't verbalise that information to me during, I suppose, the labour. Anyway, my beautiful Conor was born, and what occurred to me then was that he didn't sleep that first night in the hospital. And you might say, well, that's very typical of babies. The hospital ward is very busy. There's newborn babies crying. There's, healthcare professionals coming in and coming out. That's probably what you might expect. And I'd agree, probably would be what you might expect. What also stands out to me from that time is that he really struggled to feed that first night. And I remember saying it to the healthcare professionals, and they were saying, oh, he's just after being born, a little bit unsettled. Don't worry, Mom, he'll be okay. He's your second child. You know what you're doing. Don't worry, he'll be okay. He'll sleep and he'll feed. So that very first night, I remember holding my gorgeous Conor in my arms, and he didn't sleep that first night. And I remember hugging him and kissing him, and hugging and kissing all my love into him and his little fingers and his tiny toes, and just being mesmerised, because I already had a beautiful daughter and now I had a beautiful son. So it really was just, it was bliss, but also exhausting, because neither myself nor my gorgeous Conor slept that first night. But what I wasn't to know that first night was that would be the pattern, or that would be our new way of being, myself and Conor. We would be awake together most nights. From that moment on, my gorgeous Conor never did sleep. He never slept in his beautiful little Moses basket. I had got for him his little pirate blankets that I'd got for him. I eventually gave those away because they were literally never used. I remember that from very early on, Conor really was almost panicked if anybody other than myself or my husband held him, or it was almost like he could sense there was somebody at the door. If somebody came to visit, like I suppose as people do when a new baby is born, it was as if he panicked, because he would scream this very high-pitched scream. And I had never heard anything like it before. Again, I'm one of 11 and I'm the eldest girl of 11. So I took care of a lot of children over the course of my life. And again, I'm autistic and have a photographic memory. So I have a very strong visual memory. So I could place Haley with all of my brothers and sisters that I'd looked after. I thought, okay, she's similar to many of those individuals. But Conor stands out to me as very, very different. And I suppose when I think of it now, looking back, he really didn't sleep at all. And I would walk the floors with him, and I would have him up on my shoulder, and I'd be rubbing his little, I call it bottom of body, rubbing his bottom, or rubbing his, it would have been Conor's right foot, the base of his little right foot, and rubbing him and soothing him, trying to help him. And I'd walk around the floors all night long. Eventually he got too big to be on my shoulder, and I was probably too weak as well myself, because I suppose I'd just given birth, and then I didn't really sleep again at night time for many years. So then I took it upon myself myself that I would drive around the roads at night time because for whatever reason, motion helped Conor sleep. So I used to drive around in this little blue micra that my dad had bought me after I finished my law degree and I started training as a solicitor. So I used to drive around the roads at night time. So I've driven all over the west of Ireland, up the north of Ireland, down the south, in particular Galway, because Galway was always a place that I loved because I'd studied in the university there for my 2 degrees. And I suppose I'm back now, more recently undertaking my master's in speech and language there. But at the time I had just finished my second law degree and I was studying there. So it was something I had a really strong, positive relationship personally with Galway. So I used to drive there mostly at night time and I used to drive around Salt Hill and I would drive around the city. And I often remember driving by students and I used to feel like that was like a ghost life to me now, because my life now was with a very gorgeous little baby that seemed to have so many difficulties, but it didn't really seem to matter who I spoke to professionally in the healthcare sector about my gorgeous Conor, because he was what appeared to be quite a big baby that was putting on weight, that he was fine, that it was just, I suppose maybe I was a tired mom and he would sleep eventually, but not to worry, he was fine. But I was very, very concerned because in order to get Conor to even drink a bottle, when I mean it took hours of work just to get the bottle into Conor, I mean it literally took hours of work. He didn't seem to want to drink anything. Later when he got a little bit older, he really struggled to eat any food, to the point when I suppose after he was diagnosed, he was eventually put on what's called Fortini, a high nutritional supplement drink. Again, later I would understand that this is because he also has ARFID, but at the time I didn't know what any of these words meant. But I suppose going back to the initial days, so Conor found it incredibly difficult to sleep. He never really did sleep there was definitely no hours long of sleep ever. Unless I was driving the car, he didn't sleep. And I remember I used to drive everywhere. And I remember I used to drive through towns at night time and it was almost as if the little lights in all the windows would go off, like blink, 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 blink as I drove by. And it was like I would be saying goodbye to each of the towns as I drove around while Conor slept in the back. And this was long before the days of the iPhones and the logging on to Instagram or Facebook or whatever you like to go on to. There wasn't, or at least I didn't know how to do it back in those days for me. So I really was on my own listening to the radio. And I always remember there was a song by, my goodness, I believe it was Bruno Mars. I think it was called Talking to the Moon. And I used to listen to that and bawl crying because there would obviously be a moon out many of the nights I was driving along, or some part of a moon. And I remember bawling, crying and just wishing that somebody could help me, because really it was just myself, my husband, my gorgeous Hayley, and Granny Golden. This would be my husband's mother. There was just the three of us trying to help Conor sleep, and it never happened. Conor never was really ever able. I can't ever remember a time until he was about 2.5 that he slept in a cot at night time. He was always wide awake at night time and we were all wide awake at night time. But especially in those early days, it was probably traumatic for himself. I'm sure it was traumatic for himself. It was traumatic for me as well. I'd just given birth and I was now awake for many years afterwards. I laugh now, but it wasn't that funny at the time. But I remember that was one piece of, I suppose, one piece that I was just trying to solve. Like, how could I get my gorgeous Conor to sleep? And then later, I suppose, the whole issue with the feeding and not being able to drink was very, very, again, traumatic, because I didn't know how to support him if I couldn't get this gorgeous baby to drink and I couldn't get him to sleep. It really affected me as well personally, in that I always wanted to be like the best mother that I could be. And, I had my mother-in-law as a great role model, and I would think, gosh, why can't I be like this incredible lady? Like, she's in her, at this point, late 50s. And I thought, my God, why can't I be like Anne? And I would see like my sisters and my other family members and sister-in-laws. I'd be like, why can't I be like these incredible mothers? Why can't I help my child sleep? And it really, I suppose I sank into what I know now to be postnatal depression, but I didn't know what that was at the time. I just knew that I felt lower than the dirt underneath your shoe. Everywhere I went, I just wanted to be as invisible as possible, and I just didn't want anyone to see me, because I was afraid that if they could see me, then they would know that I was a terrible mother, because I couldn't help my gorgeous Conor sleep and I couldn't help him drink his bottles, and I just felt like the most utter failure. But I suppose the one thing I kept doing for him was that I kept bringing him to the doctor and kept bringing him to the hospital, saying, please, there's something different. He needs help, but if you could just tell me, because I suppose I am academic, I am a researcher. I felt that if I could just be told what it was that was different about my gorgeous Conor, then I could absolutely be able to help him, but I just needed to know what that was. Now, coincidentally, Conor also had a co-occurring bowel condition, and this was, I suppose, really what led towards Conor eventually being diagnosed as autistic. But I suppose what brought me to the steps of Mayo General A&E was that, I suppose I mentioned Galway earlier, but a number of weeks before I had been in Galway at night time with Conor, and I'd imagine I probably felt as low as I'd ever felt in my life. And I remember just feeling like, you know, Conor couldn't have a worse mother than me, and he couldn't have any chance of a great life if I was his mother, because no matter what I did, I couldn't help him, and I felt that I was better off if I did just disappear. And I remember one night I was parked in Salt Hill, and I had my gorgeous Conor on my shoulder, and I remember rubbing his little body. He was all wrapped up lovely and warm. But I remember I used to get out of the car, obviously, I suppose time to time, just to stretch my legs, because I'd be driving, and if Conor was awake, I would just get out of the car. And I remember getting out of the car and just looking into the beautiful ocean and just saying to myself, you know, if I wasn't here, maybe he'd have a better chance with a better mom, because this, or me as a mom, is obviously failing my gorgeous Conor. And I remember just thinking, if I just disappear now, then he'll have a better life without me. And I remember thinking the only thing that stopped me really moving forward with my decision was that I remember looking into the water and then thinking, but where will I put Conor? Because I would never harm my gorgeous Conor, but where would I put him? I thought, I can't leave him in the car because it's very cold, he'll get cold. And I was so logical in my thinking, it would scare me now to ever think that way again. But I remember thinking, could I leave him there was a Mill Street Garda station kind of up, not really up the road, but it was up the road in my mind from where I was standing. I thought I could leave him at Mill Street Garda station, then hop back in my car and then, you know, just go back down to the bay. And then I was thinking, well, actually, you know, how will I tell them he's there? And then they might stop me from leaving. So I was being so logical in my thinking, but always at the forefront of my mind was, how can I keep Conor safe? I need to disappear, but I need Conor to be safe. And I remember it was like he almost said mama, but I don't know if he did. I think maybe I imagined it, but I felt like he had said mama. And I decided then that maybe I'd go home this time and I'd come back up again another time when I'm on my own and he's home safe and I don't have to worry about where he might be when I've as I would say, disappeared. So I remember driving home and telling my husband then at the time about how I was feeling. He was obviously very concerned, and I was obviously probably not fully aware of how deeply I was enmeshed with, I suppose, postnatal depression. I later did speak to a GP and that really did support me. But I suppose ultimately I was still with my gorgeous Conor. I had at this point taken a career break thinking I would go back to my law career. But ultimately in that moment I knew it wouldn't be right now because Conor really needed me. And I suppose within a couple of weeks then later, Conor had what's called prolapsed bowel because he would struggle with constipation, and I had brought him to casualty. And at this point I still hadn't slept in, I couldn't even tell you, in almost a year. And the only way that Conor could sleep would be if I was driving the little blue micro around the roads at night time. He eventually got too big for the baby car seat, so I started to push him around the house. Our little house that we lived in at the time was like a little cottage, and I would push him around the house at night time, and I would push him in a pushchair, in case anything says push him around the house. I was pushing him around the house in a McLaren pushchair at the time, and if I kept pushing the pushchair he would sleep. I can honestly say it was the one and only time in my life that I was ever actually very slim. And I remember someone said to me at the time, God, what are you doing to lose weight? God, you look great. What are you doing to lose weight? And I was saying, oh, I don't sleep at night time. And they were like, haha, no, what are you doing? And I was like, no, I don't really get any sleep. I push a pushchair all night long. And they were like, oh, okay. And I remember being so embarrassed that I even said it. I was like, why did I say that? But it was the truth, because I suppose I'm the truth teller. I only wanted to tell the truth, but that, I suppose, didn't make sense to people that people could live that way. But that's how I was living. I was awake all day and I was awake all night. And I remember being awake all day and awake all night. Not only did it have such an impact on my gorgeous Conor, but I remember for myself, I used to have blackouts, and I was having so many blackouts that the hospital had me attend for like a heart, I'm not sure the correct terminology, like maybe a heart tracing or something. And I had a Holter monitor on for a time as well. But ultimately I used to have blackouts where I would be pushing Conor, and I don't know how I never did myself a serious injury, but I would wake up to the sound of him screaming. So I would get up again and then I'd start pushing him around the house again once I'd woken up out of the blackout. But ultimately it was obviously pure exhaustion. But I suppose between the blackouts and the driving and the exhaustion and the worry, and Conor would have this like such a different high-pitched scream if anybody came into the house. So we became very isolated as well. I didn't ever want anything to upset him, so I was trying to keep him as calm and as happy as he could be. Again, I know the language now of dysregulation, but I just saw a baby that was in distress all the time, and I didn't know what I was doing to do anything right at all. And I remember that day I went to casualty with him. He had prolapsed bowel, and I went to casualty with him in Mayo General Hospital, and I was bawling my eyes out, crying. And I remember going in and carrying him, and he was screaming the place down. Everyone, in casualty, everyone kind of looks when someone goes to the counter, but everyone was looking at me, and I'm sure they found it distressing as well and upsetting because they obviously weren't feeling well if they're in casualty. And I had a little baby that was screaming, and I was bawling, crying, and I was explaining about the prolapsed bowel. And then I remember saying to them, you can arrest me, but I will not leave this hospital with my son unless you tell me what's going on for him. And I remember bawling, crying. I said, you have to arrest me, because I said, I won't bring him home. You have to tell me. I've been here so many times, but you have to tell me now what's going on for my son. And obviously they were very concerned then if there's a mother at the counter saying, you can arrest me, but I won't bring my son home until you tell me what's going on. So luckily or unluckily, or however you look at the way they saw me in the state that I was in, they decided to admit Conor to the hospital. Now, he did have prolapsed bowel, so there was a medical reason as well, but he was admitted to the baby ward in Mayo General Hospital. And during that week, he was, they're always so lovely. They're incredible in Mayo General, especially on the children's ward and the baby ward. They were so kind to my gorgeous Conor and to myself, like so compassionate. And I remember that week they were asking me all of these different types of questions. And I know now, looking back, it was, I suppose the diagnostic criteria for autism. But back in those days, they were just asking me lots of questions and I was answering them all. And I remember during that week then, his incredible paediatric consultant came in, she's a lady, and she said to me that, your lovely Conor, the old language, because again, it's 15 years ago, she said that your lovely Conor has autism. And I remember saying, what does that mean? Like, so naively. I was saying, what does that mean? I was thinking, does he need like medication? What does he mean? I didn't really understand what anything really meant in those days. And she was saying, no, this means, and the old language was what was used because it was back in those days. She said, well, he has special needs, and that means he's a lifelong disability. And I was saying, okay, and what does he need to help him with that? And she was saying, well, you take him home and love him. And I was saying, well, I've been doing that. I just need you to tell me, what do I need to do to help him? Because my research mind was saying to me, if I could just figure out what I need to do to help him, then I can help him. But her advice then was obviously that there was, we'll say, support services in the area and that they'd be in contact once his file had been transferred or whatnot. She gave me loads of lovely, information and tons of support. But I suppose ultimately I brought my lovely Conor home after a few days after that, and told all our family, and I didn't even know what I was telling them because I didn't really understand autism then, but I just told them that he had autism, was the old language, and that meant he had special needs and that he'd need support all of his life, which is to be true. He will, and he always will need support all of his life. But I remember thinking then, well, I'll start looking for information on this, and I'm going to figure this out, and I remember promising Conor I'd figure it out, and I'll do everything I can to help you, Conor. And I suppose there and then I made that decision that I would never go back to my law career, because my advocacy that had really driven me towards law, I now had to redirect, and I suppose willfully redirect towards disability advocacy for my son. And I remember going into town trying to find any kind of books, because then if you see, I'm in my office, everything here is academic. It's all, if you could see behind the camera, there's books and research and all around me, resources based on autism. And I remember going, and the first book I ever bought on autism, it's up on a top shelf there. It was horrendous. It was called When Your Child Has the Autism. And I remember being like, what kind of a title is that? But I remember reading it, and first of all being shocked by the way that it spoke about disability and autism. But there was elements to be true about my son, saying communication differences. Now, the language they used was different, but it wouldn't be language that I would ever even be able to say correctly, because it's not the way that I would speak about disability. But they were saying it was very deficits, medicalised, very negative, the way that it was talking about autism. But there was trueness to the fact that he does have communication differences, sensory differences, social imagination, social interaction differences. So those key differences were there. But the way that the book talked about autism was almost like this autism had taken hold of my child. And I was thinking, I don't think that's very accurate. And again, this was the only book I'd ever bought on autism at that point. But I remember being very shocked by the way that it spoke about autism. It was so negative. And I remember thinking, I'll keep that book, and someday maybe I'll write a book to challenge it. Who knows if that'll happen. But I remember thinking, if that's all the information there is in autism, what will I do? Within about 2 weeks then of my gorgeous Conor being diagnosed as autistic, or identified as autistic, now the language back then was with autism, I remember being in a local store, Dunnes Stores, and I was buying these navy pantses. And I was buying these little boys' tracksuit bottoms. They were navy pantses because my gorgeous Conor, again, at that point in his life, again, he's also dyspraxic, but that wouldn't have been identified to me till later. He had a great difficulty in moving his body in coordination and a great difficulty bearing any kind of weight on his legs at that time. So he could kind of, it was like a little move around. I can't do, it's like a little hop, like this might sound very strange, like a little kangaroo, but it was very cute. He used to kind of hop around a little bit. But he would then obviously always wear out the knees of his trousers. And I guess that meant then that I would always be buying these little, they were like navy Dunstores tracksuit bottoms for boys. So anyway, I remember going in buying them, and as I was buying them, I also had these horrendous, I thought they were great at the time, but they were horrendous, no offense to River Island sunglasses, that I think the only other person I've ever seen wear something similar was Elvis. In old videos I've seen of him singing songs, so they're very bling bling. Anyway, I remember having these sunglasses on my head, and a girl that had been a few years ahead of me in a school where I went to at the time, Davos College, came over to me, and she was saying, "Oh my gosh, Amanda, I am so sorry." And I'm autistic, so I was saying, have I bumped into her? I can't think, what is she saying sorry for? She was like saying, "Well, I'm so sorry. I heard about Conor and I'm so sorry." Now, excuse my language, but this is what the lady said. She said, "I'm so sorry. But I said to Mom, it's okay." And I apologize for my language now. She said, "I'm so sorry, but I said to Mom, it's okay. He's not a complete vegetable. At least he can walk." And I remember just holding the pantses and being like, did she actually just say this about my Conor? And then also, how does she know that my Conor is autistic? And and I was just so shocked. So I remember just getting the pantses and putting them down. I don't even know where I put them down. I'm sure I put them in the wrong place. Apologies to Dunstores. I put them down. And I remember just saying, "I'm so sorry, I have to go," and getting my sunglasses and putting them on my eyes. And I just burst out crying walking out of the store. And I drove home to my mom, who had Hayley and Conor. She was looking after them while I was at the store, because Conor would have found it way too difficult to go into a store at that time. And I remember she was so upset that somebody would say that. And I was saying, "Oh, don't worry. I think it's just a one-off." Just the lady, I don't think meant to buy it. I think it was just a one-off. But what I was to learn later, I suppose, is that it wasn't just a one-off. It was the beginning of, I suppose, 15 years now of people speaking so negatively about disability and not even taking a moment's breath to be like, "Gosh, whoops, that wasn't a great thing to say." And again, I'm not blaming anyone or anything like that, but it's just happened so consistently that it is just so upsetting when it happens. I suppose what happened then was I became obviously very protective of Conor, because then it was as if he lifted a veil. Now suddenly I could see that so many people were talking so flippantly about my son and like he was a nothing, or we would be like coming out of another day, we were coming out of a supermarket and I had Hayley by the hand and Conor in the trolley. This is like, I'd say a month or two later, maybe 3 months later. I was kind of getting braver, Conor was getting braver, and we were learning to go into like supermarkets. Maybe it was 4 or 5 months later. It was still warm, so I'm going to say it could have been the other side of January, so more than 5 or 6 months later maybe. And I remember holding Hayley, and Conor was in the trolley. He got I think it was a little tractor, and to the side of the supermarket where we were that day, Conor had got a little toy. Me and Hayley were celebrating because he was able to manage to go into the store, and he picked his toy. And again, Conor is non-speaking. I was non-speaking then, but he was really happy, and he was making these beautiful sounds that let me know that he was happy. But the young people, I'm going to say, and again, I'm not targeting any particular age group, but I would say, I'd imagine, looking from a distance, it was a teenage cohort of individuals. And I remember they were saying, and again, I won't say the word because it's so offensive, but they were saying, "Oh, look at him, he's a R. It starts with R, ends with D." So I won't say the word, so hopefully you can imagine what it is. Oh, hopefully you don't have to imagine what it is, but it's horrible. And they were saying, "Oh, he's the R word, the R word." And then one of the boys was making like gestures because Conor was like stimming with his beautiful little hands because he was so excited. And they were making the sounds that Conor was making, and they were laughing at him. And I remember I just rushed Hayley to the car and Conor to the car. And I remember just being like, "Oh my gosh, I hope Hayley didn't notice. I hope Conor didn't notice." And I remember crying. Of course, I had the bling bling glasses on again, and I was trying to drive away. I don't even think I put back the trolley properly. Apologies to Tesco. And I drove away bawling. And Hayley was saying, "Mom, why did we rush away there, Mom?" And I was saying, she was only little, and I was saying, "Oh, I think it's going to rain." And she was like, "Yeah, but but Mom, it's really sunny and you're wearing your sunglasses, so it's not going to rain. Is it because of what the boys were saying? And she would talk in her baby voice, going, copying Conor. And I was saying, no, what did you see? And she was saying, obviously, what had happened. And I said, yeah, I said, I think they just don't understand people that are different. And she was saying, that makes my heart really cross. And I'm going to tell them they're bold and they can't do that. She was saying, that's my brother Conor. And I was saying, I know my lovely Hayley. I said, but I'll talk to them another day and I'll tell them. And you could just see that, I could just see for the first time, it wasn't just me and it wasn't just Conor, his big sister, I call her little, his sister Hayley, who's still only a tiny child herself, was now experiencing these horrendous experiences as well. And again, to what level Conor understood, I don't know, but I know that myself and Hayley fully understood what they were doing and what they were trying to do. And I remember just being so sad about it and thinking, how can this be that we can talk so horribly about any other human being and not consider the impact that could have? I just remember being so devastated by it all. I think what really stands out to me for that time is that despite now knowing that Conor was autistic, I had to continue to drive, helping Conor sleep at night. Driving had to continue. When the driving wasn't possible anymore because he was getting too big for the car seat, I would push him around the house in the McLaren pushchair. When that wasn't possible, we would just sit up all night with him on my lap if that didn't work either. Say if the pushing in the pushchair and the driving didn't work, we would just stay awake together all night long, and I would sing him songs or tell him stories, or sometimes we'd watch cartoons or we'd just play in the living room. And I just remember always feeling like an on edge feeling, because if I went out into society with Conor, people would say horrible things or react or like stare, literally that phrase, stare me out of a place just so that we'd leave. There was horrible comments coming all the time. And I just remember thinking, like, how can it be that people think it's okay to speak this way or act this way about people that are different? And then I felt very ignorant in that before my son was born and before my son was identified as being officially different, he was autistic, that I never paid heed to that, because again, it wouldn't be naturally, hopefully, ever within me to be that way. And now suddenly everywhere I went, it was everywhere and I could see it everywhere. And later I would join Facebook groups and I would read it everywhere, and the experiences families were having everywhere. And I remember just being so devastated. I just so devastated that this was now our life. I suppose, oh gosh, I'm nearly at half an hour. Listen, I'll end this episode here and I'll go on to episode 2 next. So if you've listened this far, thank you so much for being here with me. And I always say thank you so much for being here with me, because I long remember all the nights on the road and the worry and the fear and the having nobody. And back in those days, there wasn't the internet like there is now, where I couldn't access it. And I was always on my own. And I used to think, oh, wouldn't it be lovely if someone was in the passenger seat that I could just chat to as I was driving around at night time. So thank you when I say genuine thanks for being here with me. I really appreciate it. So listen, I will go on to episode 2 next. So thanks if you've listened this far, and thank you. On to episode 2.